Well, thank you so much, Melissa and Peter, other friends, Cynthia at USF. It's really a delight to be here of all places, and I'll mention in a moment why I'm personally particularly excited to be on campus here at USF and talking with the Center for Asia Pacific Studies. So thanks to everyone who's here in the room, and also to those of you who are watching. As Melissa said, I'm really going to be focusing talking about this book, Agents of Subversion, which came out not too long ago. And of course, the ultimate goal of this session is to get everyone who listens to it to buy the book. You know, there's crass materialism is involved here. But, you know, you work hard on, and many years, it was probably 8 years from start to finish on a project. And of course, you want to share it with people. So it's a lot of fun to talk to different kinds of audiences, and in particular students, about the book, and then to lure you into maybe reading it. So I will try to give kind of an overview of what the book covers, but I also thought I'd add maybe a slight meta level in terms of history. You know, I was trained from my undergraduate through PhD years in the discipline of history. And even though some of the things I write, I wonder, this is not history, what am I doing? But at my core, I'm a historian, and that's the discipline I love. And so I thought I'd try to add some reflections on the different types of history or historiography that I used, that I sort of found I needed to use in order to write the story that I wanted to tell. So there's kind of a story level to all of this, and then there's a broader set of historical issues involved in U.S. and the U.S. and China. Just quickly, if you'll bear with me, little shout out to the home crowd here at USF. One of the reasons that I was excited to speak here is that my father and namesake John Delury was a proud Don and USF graduate, and actually I hadn't seen this before. I just stumbled on this when I was asked for my PPT in advance, and found myself in the rabbit hole of various yearbooks, which are easily accessible, old USF yearbooks. And I'll explain in a minute. I actually did a fair bit of research through yearbooks because I in the book talk about Yale a lot, the Yale of the late 1940s and early 1950s. So I actually find old yearbooks to be particularly interesting historical sources. And, you know, here's, in all his glory, here's the original John Delury, president of the History Club of all things. That was his big activity at USF. And the dates were particularly fun, because I'll come back to these dates, but Dad described the first meeting of the USF History Club on October 2nd, 1952. And it's just by happenstance, that's the exact moment of the kind of big spy story that lies at the core of my book. I also have to give another shout out to a great USF alum. I don't know if anyone recognizes this man. He's actually not, his name is not included, but that's Leo T. McCarthy. Back in his youth. There's a wonderful line here: the class officers serve as the often unmentioned but truly important majority of the executive council. So I don't know how student government works now, but I read somewhere else that Leo, who was a good friend of my dad's and a mentor, he was my godfather. He's actually the person who got me to China in the first place. So he played a very big role in my life. But I read somewhere else Leo ran and lost for class president. So evidently he found this executive council as the way to exert his political influence. So for fun, I thought I would share my discoveries from some USF history. But to get us back to the main story here, rather than California or USF, the focal point for a lot of my book, for actually the first section of the book, the first part of the book, and even the subtitle should have probably had Yale somewhere in there, because, you know, so this is a warning, or if you're interested, this would be a reason to maybe check it out. There's quite a bit of kind of the history of Yale. And in some ways, that's because, you know, I went to Yale. I spent about a dozen years, so it's a place I'm familiar with. And I thought it'd be really interesting to approach it as a historian. But in terms of the story I'm telling, the reason is this man here, who's in the subtitle of the book, John T. Downey, and I'll be eventually talking about him. But Downey is the kind of central actor, as it were, in this CIA story that takes place in China. But prior to that, he had studied at Yale. He was in the class of 1951. So that means he entered in the fall of 1947. And because he's important later in the story, I kind of backed up and in the research process thought, how much can I use Yale as a microcosm of this moment in, actually, this is American history, in very early Cold War. He's basically in the first class of the Cold War, right? As he's starting is months after Harry Truman declares the Truman Doctrine before Congress, which is kind of the unofficial declaration of Cold War. So John Downey and his classmates in the class of 1951 are really the first group to go to college under that new kind of framework of American foreign policy. And so I wanted to go back and learn as much as I could and do research on Yale of the kind of post-World War II Yale of the late 1940s and early 1950s, and see if I could use that to generate some new windows or insights into what is basically intellectual history. And I'm not trained in American intellectual history, but I did do a lot of work on Chinese intellectual history. So I thought, okay, I know some basic ideas about how you do the history of ideas, and it's always been, to me, probably the most interesting kind of field of historiography. And so Yale functioned in my research and then in the book as, again, a kind of microcosm, a smaller window to understand how the formation of American thinking about its place in the world, and then one more layer of specificity. This is ultimately about China. This is about U.S.-China relations. So I went back and looked at what was China studies like in late 1940s Yale. The equivalent of the Center for Asia-Pacific Studies would be the Far Eastern Studies program at Yale. How did that program work? Who taught what at Yale? Who were the big historians? Who were the political scientists? And from that, I kind of built up essentially a cast of characters, read a lot of their articles and books, and tried to sort of reconstruct the world of using one obviously very elite institution, but not necessarily, and the premise is not Yale is the most important place in the country for the study of China. While it's not typical, I chose it in part because I wanted to see if we almost randomly choose one place, what will be revealed. So that was kind of the method of intellectual history, as it were. And I came across what I thought was a pretty interesting cast of characters. Some you might, depending on your interests, you might recognize or have heard of. Probably in this montage, the most famous figure is here. That's a young William F. Buckley Jr., who goes on to play a pretty profound role in American politics, in the emergence of conservatism, modern, or by some definitions, neoconservatism. So William F. Buckley was a year ahead of Downey. He was in the class of 1950, and there's tons of stuff to find out. He's an easy research target because he was very active as an undergraduate. This is, a kind of stage shot of him as editor of the Yale Daily News, where he really used, and you can see his career being launched, where he's using journalism, student journalism, to articulate this kind of new, very combative, it's all too familiar for us now, very aggressive form of kind of right-wing conservatism, and getting in big fights with many of the professors, and in particular, the college president. So this is Whit Griswold, who came in I think it was 1950s. He was actually relatively young. He was a historian. And he, these were the days when the Yale president would get on the cover of Time magazine and everyone would read Time magazine. So it was a very different information ecosystem than the world we live in. But in a way, he was here literally the face, not only of Yale and higher education, but also a kind of liberalism, this very sort of quintessential, still very elitist, but, academic freedom of speech, and kind of liberal values Griswold took those very seriously and considered himself and was considered nationally as kind of a stalwart proponent of those. And almost inevitably, he and Buckley start clashing. And again, that was really interesting to reconstruct using Yale's archives, which are quite research friendly, to find all the scheming and the both the public side as well as the behind the scenes argument that emerged between those two. Now, as you get into the later stages like Downey's junior and senior year, 50 and 51, we'll come back to some of this, but by then, of course, McCarthyism is in full force. And so Buckley's, at the student level, kind of campaign to shake up Yale and attack its liberal values in the name of conservatism are being mirrored at a national level by Senator Joe McCarthy. It's really the high tide of McCarthyism. So there's a much larger national story in terms of the intellectual history of this Cold War moment of the rise of McCarthyism. The last figure here, and he was probably the most obscure, but at the time was like the big guy in terms of Chinese politics, the study of Chinese politics, and also coming to questions of American foreign policy. What should America's China policy be? One of the top experts in the nation was David Rao. I don't know if that name, I'm constantly checking audiences in different groups to see who's heard of David Rao. He's sort of fallen into the mists of obscurity, but he was a big guy at the time, and he was writing both books and articles and had sort of a national platform, again, in a very different media environment, a more unitary media environment. And Rao, in a way, would be almost like a complement to William F. Buckley, except he's the China hand. He has a China focus. He's interested in foreign policy questions. And Rao was arguing what could be considered a kind of conservative view of and conservative critique of the Truman administration for being too soft on China, too weak on China, not recognizing the communist threat, not supporting the nationalists, right, on Taiwan, eventually by 1949, not supporting Chiang Kai-shek strongly enough. Ultimately, Rao's view is the United States should have been directly involved in the Chinese Civil War, which was unfolding from 1946 to 1949. And then once the Civil War had went on pause with Chiang Kai-shek having sort of fled to Taiwan, Rao's view, which he continues to argue throughout the 1950s and 60s, is the United States should be doing absolutely everything it can to support Chiang Kai-shek and ultimately to overthrow the communist regime. That's sort of the organizing principle of Rao's writings and public argument. So, there's a lot more. This is, again, to lure you to reading of the book. If you have interests, not so much on the Chinese side, actually, a lot of it is really on the US side, but the debates about China that were going on in the late 1940s and into the early 50s, that's a large part of what I was trying to reconstruct in sort of the first part of the book. Again, it's not all American history. I'm trying to do what the fancy word for it is transnational history, which I have a very simplistic understanding of in terms of how I try to do transnational history in my book, is mostly kind of toggling back and forth between America and the United States, and looking for connection points, also sometimes symmetries between the two, contrasts, of course, as well between the two. But for me, it's a very simple-minded practice of kind of bringing the reader, based on my research, back and forth between the United States and China, and of course, paying particular attention to some of the figures who cross the line. So as far as the intellectual history part, which is the primary focus of the first kind of third of the book, in addition to looking at kind of the China debates and the China policy debates in the United States in the early Cold War, I also look at one idea in particular, which is the idea of the third force. And I guess maybe I could push the idea of transnational historiography here to say that I tried to sort of construct for the reader the way in which the third force was like a global idea. It was moving on a global scale for a relatively small window of time. So it's not something that remained in much currency past the late 1940s. But there's this important window of time where a lot of people are talking about the third force. And as you see, when I get to the spy drama, the third force is a critical part of that. So I looked at sort of the third force, both in China and also in the West, in the United States, and probably more importantly in Europe, because that term third force, at least when it's used in an English language context, at this time, post-World War II, mostly would be associated with Europe, and in particular with a French socialist leader, Léon Blum, who makes a big speech and turns it into an article, and it's translated in different languages, arguing for an international third force. The idea, in a way, is very simple. The idea of the third force is something in between. For example, as the French socialist would present it, the third force is something in between Soviet communist totalitarianism, that's left, out here on the left, which of course is not the way to go. But out here, he would have said on the right, is American kind of extremist individualism, individualist capitalism, which doesn't suit Europe, doesn't suit European culture and values, and what is basically a kind of socialist middle alternative. So that is one prominent form of articulating this idea of a third force. And Blum makes this an argument not only for France, but also more broadly for Europe. He argues European countries should together adopt this kind of third force position, positioning themselves in between the United States on one end and the Soviet Union on the other. So that's one manifestation. That was interestingly picked up in the United States in a, I thought, a fascinating book by Arthur Schlesinger, who wrote a book called The Vital Center, 1949. The Vital Center is essentially Schlesinger trying to transmute the French socialist idea into an American context, but say we in America, and he's really addressing himself actually to the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party should embrace this kind of third force idea for a more progressive America. So Vital Center is almost a translation to try to bring this third force idea into an American political context. I focused, explaining the connections with these global ideas. There's a whole Chinese context to this. Because if you think about that moment in time, we're talking about kind of 1948, 49, 50, you'll see even into 1952, there's actually increasing attention paid by Americans to the possibility of a third force as the solution for China. Now, in a Chinese context of the late 40s, early 50s, what is the third force? The third force is not Mao Zedong and the communists, who have just won power, but we don't know if they're really going to be able to keep hold of it. And certainly we don't want to work together with communists. We're fighting the communists, the Soviets. So Mao Zedong is one force. The other is Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, but the view of Chiang Kai-shek is quite disillusioned by this period of time. And Chiang Kai-shek has nearly lost the Civil War, so he's not seen as having much capacity to actually defend himself, let alone dislodge Mao and the communists. And so with that as kind of the second force, the idea is there someone else, right? Chinese political actors and then military actors who can be the non-communist alternative, an alternative to Mao, but also an alternative to Chiang Kai-shek. That's the third force idea. And the group that they end up with, and so this, just to explain the pictures, this is George Marshall, the great World War II hero, who was sent by Harry Truman in the early stages of the Chinese Civil War to try to figure out if he can somehow broker some kind of peace between Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, and this is actually Zhou Enlai, not Mao Zedong, but between the nationalists and the communists. So while Marshall is seeing what he can do to mediate between the two major forces, Marshall and other Americans are also kind of dabbling in this idea of, well, is there some third force out there? Not non-communist, but also not nationalist. And the people that they're looking at are this man in particular, who's an heir to one of the great figures, very influential figures of early 20th century China, Liang Qichao, right? So Liang Qichao is kind of the forerunner of this third force idea. Since the early 1900s, and certainly since the birth of the Republic of China in 1912, Liang Qichao, who's kind of one of he would be the PIP of the ultimate godfather of PIP of the Public Intellectuals program. But Liang Qichao is trying to create some kind of center to Chinese politics, some sort of alternative. And of course, by having a third party, as it was sometimes called in the early stages, or a third force, Liang's vision is you're ultimately guaranteeing a democracy because you've got three options, right? His sort of successor in that project, that third force project, is this one of his students and proteges, Zhang Junmai or Carson Chang. He published under the English name Carson Chang. And he has a fascinating biography of his own, which I won't go into, but suffice it to say that Carson Chang tries to carry this idea that he gets from his teacher Liang Qichao forward into the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and even into the early 1950s. Carson Chang is arguing to an American audience, and he writes a book in the fall of 1942 called The Third Force in China, where in 300 pages he lays out this argument. Obviously, America can't and should not want to back the communists. They will be a disaster for China. But by now, Americans should also know that Chiang Kai-shek is not the solution. And so, staying tied to Chang, who Carson Chang describes as basically a fascist, that is not the way to go for America. The solution is for the United States and the West to support us, the third force, right? So he publishes that book. He's been writing about it and doing it in Chinese, in China, in exile for decades. But in 1952, he kind of writes it up almost as an opus in English to try to lobby, to try to persuade the US government and sort of influential figures, public opinion makers, to support the third force. So now we get to we're kind of moving out of the intellectual history, and now we get into the spy stuff, intelligence history. Because right at the moment, basically, that Carson Chang is making this intellectual argument for a alternative political ally for China, an alternative future for China, non-communist future for China. By this point, the CIA is knee-deep in a clandestine project, operation or series of operations to weaponize what Carson Chang is talking about, to actually arm the third force covertly, train them, and infiltrate them into the People's Republic of China, where their mission is overthrow Mao Zedong. So, and this is the project that now we're kind of moving to the second part of the book, and you can read more for all the gory details of how this worked. But the short story of this covert operation, you can kind of imagine it in your mind. It starts in Hong Kong. That's where the CIA, through their cutouts and friends, does their recruiting for these third force leaders, both political leaders, military leaders, as well as foot soldiers, actual agents who are going to do stuff. Why Hong Kong? Because Hong Kong is the place that anti-communists fled if they really hated communism, but also really hated Chiang Kai-shek. Otherwise, they would go to Taiwan. So about 2 million anti-communists, let's just call them, follow Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan. But another 1 million people end up in Hong Kong as refugees of one form or another. And a certain pool of them are very good targeting recruits for the CIA, with this pitch of, don't you want to go home and get rid of the communists? But you'll be doing it not in the name of Chiang Kai-shek, not in the name of the nationalists. You'll be doing it for this cause you truly believe in, for the third force. So recruitment in Hong Kong. They're flown then to Saipan, the island in the Western Pacific, where they do their training. They're kind of very basic, very crude, but paramilitary training and training in spycraft. And then they're flown, they spend a little bit of time at the major CIA hub in Japan, kind of attached to the naval base, US naval base. And then they're flown through Korea, South Korea. And of course, we're now into the Korean War, which starts in the summer of 1950. And so by 1952, this program is up and running. They've been recruited, they've been trained, and they're being deployed. The CIA, or its cutout airline called CAT, is flying almost on a monthly basis, flying unmarked planes leaving from Seoul, flying into the People's Republic of China and dropping these agents, dropping teams. Now the scale is small, but again, it's roughly monthly flights, first to drop the teams in and then to keep them resupplied. And finally, we get to John Downey. You remember him from his Yale football team photo. Downey comes into the picture because, like many of his classmates, he joins the CIA. The CIA is recruiting Third Force agents in Hong Kong. They're recruiting Yale graduates in New Haven, and have very extensive recruiting, operation, in particular at Ivy League schools, but just across the country, at colleges. And so, and this is the mobilization of the Korean War. So Downey joins the CIA directly out of Yale in the summer of 1951. After his own very cursory training, he's then deployed, sent off to work on this operation I've been describing. And in the fall, in November, he flies in himself on this particular mission, which you can kind of see from the photos here. I'll explain what's going on. So at headquarters in Japan, the CIA has received very encouraging messages from one of the agents. And the agent says, look, things are good. I got documents. There's contacts here. There's some promising. And he says, come pick me up. Okay, so it's dangerous, and you could argue crazy enough that the CIA is flying, secretly, covertly into China at the height of the Korean War, when the US government, including the president, is saying we will leave China alone. That's one of kind of the gentleman's agreement aspects of the Korean War. The CIA is secretly flying in. They're dropping out men. They're dropping out agents, Chinese agents. They're dropping out supplies. But now they want to get someone out. So how are they going to get them out? They can't land at the airport, in Shenyang and fly back, right? This is hostile territory. And so their plan is to use this experimental system of picking up a person without landing the plane. And if you look carefully, you can see how this works. The plane comes around the first time and drops a box of the tools that are needed. And then the guy on the ground opens the box and he sets up these two poles, kind of like a football goal. He strings a chain around that, a long chain that's connected to a harness, like a backpack that he puts on. And then he lies down on the ground here. Meanwhile, the plane has come around for a second loop, and it's flying as low and as slow as it can. And you can see another chain, and there's a hook here. So the plane's going to come down and catch this hook and keep going. This plane is being operated by 4 non-Chinese speaking Caucasian American men. The pilot and co-pilot actually don't work for the CIA. They work for an airline that the CIA has secretly bought out. It later becomes known as Air America. It was very active for decades in Southeast Asia. So it was called CAT at the time. So these 2 guys are actually pilots for this airline. And then you've got John T. Downey and Richard Fecteau, 2 young CIA officers, there in the back. Downey and Fecteau are there to work the winch to pull this guy up midair, assuming you catch him and you don't break his neck in the initial moment of pulling him up from the ground. So that's the plan. Now it's kind of spoiler alert. Maybe people want to cover their ears. You guys are unfortunately going to be subjected to it, but maybe those watching at home cannot listen. This flight, thank God for the person on the ground. They're not able to actually try this. Unfortunately for these 4 men, 2 are killed. The pilot and co-pilot are killed, probably with the gunfire. Downey and Fecteau survive, but the plane is shot down. The entire thing is a trap that's been laid quite systematically. And in the book, I reconstruct how Chinese counterintelligence picked up almost everyone involved in these operations, and not only picked up the agents of subversion, but also used them to send messages to lure in another plane, and the plane is shot down. This photo I couldn't resist, because again, when you're doing this history, for historians, just two things happening at the same time sometimes is super interesting. I think in economics and in other social sciences, you're usually looking for some causation, but in history, just two things happening at the same time is actually fun, and sort of enough. So one of the research moments that I sort of had to keep double checking the timing, is this true? At the same time that Downey and Fecter go on this ill-fated mission, this is the end of November, November 29th, 1952. So right after Carson Chang has published his big opus, The Third Force in China, but literally simultaneously with it, President-elect Dwight Eisenhower is on a secret flight from Long Island, and he makes many stops, eventually flying to the front line in Korea, where they took off from, to fulfill his campaign promise that in part helped get him elected at a kind of peak of the Korean War, when the Korean War was hugely unpopular with the American public. Eisenhower, as part of his campaign to replace the Democrats, said, "I'll go to Korea." And everyone was really excited. They didn't quite know what that meant, but people interpreted it as somehow he's going to end the Korean War. And he actually didn't quite know what it meant or what he was going to do, but he knew it was very popular, and he was smart. He knew he better get that trip over with. So Eisenhower, this is actually the first trip, I believe, to Asia by a sitting president of the United States. And it's Eisenhower's flight out to the Korean War front. It's initially secret, covert, but then on the way back, he has press with him. So the press are allowed to start reporting the trip once he's safely out of Korea. So I don't know how I'm doing on time, Melissa. You can cut me off. It's not looking good, but I'll keep moving the story forward, because I definitely want to have a chance for conversation and any questions or discussion. But in this, we're now in the we're out of, actually, the second part of the book, which again is why we're all here, is a lot of the intelligence history. I get into the whole formation of the CIA, the different purposes, the different missions that the CIA is given, the way in which this kind of clandestine covert action, which is really paramilitary in nature, starts to overwhelm what is, in fact, the primary mission, and that's a quote from the CIA director at the time, the primary mission of the CIA, of the Central Intelligence Agency, was not to do this kind of stuff. The primary mission was what was then called strategic intelligence. We might call it analysis, analytical work. The CIA was supposed to be a bunch of not only guys, actually, men and women, more or less sitting in their offices, analyzing information, much closer to what academics do. That and kind of also bringing in all of the information, including clandestine espionage done by embassies and done by military intelligence. The CIA were supposed to be the kind of civilian people who processed all that, who analyzed it, and then who sort of briefed the president and sort of explained to the president what this information kind of adds up to. So there's quite a bit in the book, not only of the spy stuff and how these covert activities, were kind of implemented, but also how that inner tension in the sort of two purposes of the CIA, how that played out, and then particularly because of the Korean War, the way in which the clandestine monkey business overwhelmed what many consider the primary mission. So moving into part 3 of the book, I'd say there's a fair bit of transnational political history, where I'm looking at and if there's kind of a grand thesis here, it would be the relationship between subversion and repression, a kind of feedback loop, where the two are reinforcing one another, that's happening simultaneously in the United States and China in this window of time in the kind of early 1950s. Because as I mentioned before, this is really the heyday. I mean, Joe McCarthy does his first trial run in early 1950, but it's with the Korean War that he really is able to occupy central attention and have this national platform using Senate hearings to generate the second Red Scare. So the way in which McCarthy exemplifies the use and manipulation of fears of subversion to generate a level of political repression that the United States had not seen in some time, and still sets one of the high bars for repressive politics in America under what we call McCarthyism. I have to say, it wasn't until I did the research for this book that I realized the degree to which China scholars were and initially the first target of McCarthy, and the way in which Senator McCarthy used China policy, used what was called the loss of China, the fact that China had gone communist, as one of the central nodes. It was not only fear of the Soviet Union, in a way, the even more emotional issue that he used to kind of get this whole public following was blaming the loss of China on China scholars, on China experts in government and out, and creating the argument that the reason we lost China is traitors amongst us, enemies within, communist agents, basically. So this is the most famous case. The first case is Owen Lattimore, who could have easily been maybe as obscure as David Rao. Maybe not. His books, I think, were a bit better than Rao's. But Owen Lattimore, is a big name and was well known, but only in scholarly circles, only in those who were really interested in Far Eastern studies or China studies or Inter-Asian studies. But McCarthy got Owen Lattimore's name on the front page of the New York Times when he leaked to the press and labeled Owen Lattimore the top Soviet agent at work in the United States, right? So even in going after a China scholar, he still frames him as working for the Soviets. But you can see through McCarthy how the fear of subversion, that communist agents are trying to subvert American democracy, supports his kind of repressive politics of senatorial inquisition. And of course, the same thing in a different form is happening at this time in China, because it's in the context of the Korean War that Mao really starts to unveil nationwide mass campaigns. The first major campaigns of the Mao era are the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, and then the campaign to eliminate counter-revolutionaries. And these are launched in 1950, 1951, the beginning of sustained extreme repressive domestic politics through mass campaigns of Maoism, again, in the name of combating subversion, right? In a way, both Mao and McCarthy have some credibility to their arguments. There are subversive forces, there are subversive threats, right? There are spies working on, trying to find atomic secrets in the United States and feed them to the Soviets. And there certainly are, as my book documents, there are certainly CIA-trained agents of subversion quite active in the People's Republic of China. But both of them use these threats and inflate, pump up, spread nationwide hysteria to, again, feed the most repressive possible response that the two systems could sort of envision. Moving out of that kind of transnational political history, the last bit of the book becomes maybe conventional, but I think particularly for the moment that we're in, maybe resonant diplomatic history. So I look at the relationship that unfolds between the United States and China in the kind of aftermath of this intense moment of fighting one another in the Korean War. And the narrative goes all the way through the 1950s, 1960s, and actually all the way up until the breakthrough of the Kissinger and Nixon visits. I found that, as a historian, really interesting to research, because you could feel the secondary scholarship gets quite thin. And so I always tell, especially student audiences, I think there's a lot of room to do more research, more work on the later 1950s, and in terms of US-China relations, in terms of what's happening there, and the China debates and China policy. The Kennedy and Johnson years are even thinner. It gets very lean. And then everyone starts, it thickens again once you get to Nixon. But I think there's still, I tried to, at least kind of lay out and explore some of those issues, but I think there's a lot more interesting work that can be done on that period that may be relevant now, because we seem to be reverting to that mode of relationship between the United States and China. And the way that I researched this and the way I kind of told the story, the key figure who emerged of great interest to me was actually John Downey's mother, Mary Downey, who is just an extraordinary figure, and took on a larger kind of significance, maybe even symbolic significance in the story I was trying to tell. She's an extraordinary figure because when it's finally revealed, and if there are questions, I can explain more, but the Chinese government says nothing about the fact that they shot down this plane and captured 2 CIA agents alive. They say nothing for 2 years. And in that period of time, Mary Downey is told by the CIA her son is dead. So she grieves for the loss of her son. And then suddenly, Thanksgiving 1954, the Chinese media announced, and we just sentenced to prison terms, agents of imperialist, subversion. Dick Fecteau is given 20 years, and John Downey was given a life sentence. So suddenly, Mary Downey is now told 2 years later, having grieved the loss of her son, he's alive and well in a prison in China where he'll spend the rest of his life. What she is not told is that the Chinese government, at the level of Zhou Enlai, who was personally involved in kind of this case for decades, actually, Zhou Enlai offered that she could visit. There were other Americans as well. So families of detained Americans were invited to come visit. The State Department didn't tell Mary Downey initially. Once she found out, she said, okay, I want to go see my son. And the State Department started to use kind of hook and crook to prevent her from getting a passport. And also keep in mind, in the 1950s, it was illegal for US citizens to travel to China at all. So she would have, although it's questionable if that was constitutional, but she would have required some kind of special permission by the government to even go. Mary Downey doesn't give up. She keeps, finding every lever she can. She uses the United Nations, which got involved. The Secretary General got involved in this case or in a similar kind of case. She uses the UN. She meets with one president after another. She's finally allowed, first in 1958, to visit Beijing. So she holds the record for being the first private American citizen to visit the People's Republic of China with the permission of her government. It's the first case since 1949. There have been only a handful of other US citizens who had visited without permission. She goes to the prison. Her trip was actually funded by the CIA. So weirdly, it's a CIA operation, but you could say this was a friendly covert operation. And anyway, I found it fascinating using the sources I could to kind of reconstruct her trips. She ended up making a half dozen visits to China from 1958 until I think the last one was 1970. So if you think about it, these are the years when almost no one is going. It's extremely rare for Americans to be going. And she's an, elementary school teacher from Connecticut, going because her son is serving out a life sentence in a Chinese prison. So she became, for me, a fascinating window, both just in terms of reconstructing her experiences, but also, as I said, the larger kind of symbolic value to me of her is you kind of see through her, and this is John Downey's brother, Bill, who accompanied her. These are mothers of other CIA officers who had been imprisoned. You really see through the struggles of these families, the way in which they end up having to fight the national security state. By that, I mean the US national security state. And you see through the documents, sometimes in ways that at least turned my stomach, how the State Department is creating these kind of Kafkaesque delays to prevent them from seeing their sons and their family members based on this anti-communist Cold War ideology of any contact with the Chinese is bad. They will use it for propaganda. And so there's a kind of battle that goes on between families and the state. Well, I'm reaching the end here, but the denouement, there's kind of two levels of denouement. Again, it becomes a lot of diplomatic history in terms of the ending of the book. And for me, going back and looking at a lot of the original sources, which are just marvelous in terms of the transcripts and the records of Kissinger's talks with Zhou Enlai, later a bit with Mao, and Nixon's talks with Mao. I took what I think is a fresh look at that well-known story of the breakthrough in US-China relations by really focusing on the intelligence aspect, the CIA aspect, including Downey and Fecteau's case itself, because Kissinger and Nixon made a point of adding that to the agenda. That was something they felt had to get done in order to create this breakthrough. And I would give them credit for being, savvy about how to deal with that issue in terms of the diplomacy of that moment. But there's a larger story, especially by this point, in terms of the role of secrecy in politics. And, for me, there's a kind of irony that it's Henry Kissinger and Nixon who do create this breakthrough. And I would argue in a current context as well, ultimately a positive breakthrough of kind of shifting US relations from a fundamentally secretive, covert relationship into an open public relationship where the two governments, even if they don't agree, they have official relations, they meet, there's increased opportunity for Americans and Chinese to interact with one another. There's no question Kissinger and Nixon get credit for that. At the same time, they are, of course, bringing the role of the covert, of secrecy to new heights or depths in terms of American politics and the conduct of American foreign policy. So while you could argue it creates a positive breakthrough for diplomacy vis-a-vis China, terrible things are happening in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, all being done in a covert manner, right? And of course, that ultimately all cascades into what's known as Watergate. So the final chapter, I guess in particular, the book takes you sort of deep into that irony, I suppose, is the best way to describe it. It's also very interesting, again, looking at the dialogue between Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, all the ways in which the CIA comes up. And you can see in Zhou Enlai's mind, and Kissinger's constantly trying to kind of parry and change the topic, but Zhou Enlai is adamant, he's insistent that the United States has to take some level of public responsibility for what it's done and fundamentally change the way it conducts itself towards China in terms of the reliance on covert activities. So the two men are finally released. Fecto was released in December 1971. And, if you know your basic timeline of US-China relations, that's a couple months before before Nixon's visit. So it was very much done as actually it was close to the end of Fecto's term anyway, but it was accelerated as a humanitarian kind of goodwill gesture. But the Zhou Enlai, the Chinese, did not release Downey. And so when Nixon is getting a tour of the Forbidden City, Downey is in a prison cell not far away. It takes until March of 1973 when Downey is released. Maybe you can get it out of me in the Q&A if you really care to. Otherwise, please read the book for the full explanation of that timing. But it takes more. Suffice it to say that it takes more than Henry Kissinger to get Downey released. So with that maybe abrupt ending, that comes to the end of my comments. Then I gather it's a custom here, which I love, that presentations end with some suggestions for further reading. So quickly, if this story interests you, there was no collusion between our projects, but a complementary book that I would highly recommend is actually a memoir by John Downey, which he left unpublished at his death, but has been published, came out a couple months ahead of my book, called Lost in the Cold War. And that's a really fascinating kind of prison memoir where he talks about his experiences, 20 plus years in prison in China. Again, historians always find excuses to read or reread their favorite novels and somehow slip them in their book. And for me, one of those was Graham Greene's Quiet American, which is, if you haven't read it, just incredible, kind of timeless, has a timeless quality in terms of a cynical reflection on espionage and secrecy in international politics. And then lastly, Reinhold Niebuhr's Irony of American History was a book that somehow I had missed all through my education, but I found that, again, timeless in its relevance. I think I was reading it in the Trump years and found, I don't know if solace is the right word. I can't think of quite the right word for it, but let's just say plenty of irony. But it's a beautifully written book, and it's a really profound reflection on something that I think is still at the core of American identity. And so I couldn't weave it in enough into the story I was telling, although I did kind of go out of my way to bring in some Niebuhr. But in terms of further reading, that would be at the top of my list as well, for books I discovered along the way that that are incredible adventures. So yeah, let me stop there, Melissa, and open it up for discussion.